My name is Emma Turner. I'm in my mid-30s, and for most of my adult life, I've played roles that look unremarkable from the outside. I've been the dependable one, the calm one, the person who listens more than she speaks, who delivers without asking for credit, who keeps the wheels turning quietly while others stand in the light. If you met me back then, you might have thought I was agreeable, maybe even forgettable. Someone safe, someone grateful just to be included. People often underestimate me because I don't announce myself. I don't dominate rooms. I don't interrupt. I learned early that being composed and capable often gets mistaken for being passive. Silence was expected. Gratitude demanded. And for a long time, I accepted that misunderstanding because it seemed easier than correcting it. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about exposing villains or staging dramatic confrontations. It's about something subtler and in many ways harder to explain. The slow realization that my role was to stay quiet and be grateful. I resigned from that role. Not loudly, not publicly, but decisively. What you're about to hear is a first-person account of how invisibility can be assigned, how disrespect can be normalized, and how silence, when chosen deliberately, can become a form of quiet dominance. It's a story of psychological reversal, not through manipulation or aggression, but through clarity, boundaries, and timing. Over the next chapters, I'll walk you through who I was to them, the first small cut that no one noticed, and how repeated dismissals taught me to rationalize my own erasure. You'll hear about the moment something shifted inside me, not because someone finally crossed a dramatic line, but because I finally saw the pattern clearly. From there, the story becomes one of preparation, not protest, observation, not accusation, movement without noise. There are no sudden miracles here. No lottery wins, no secret benefactors, no cinematic speeches. Just documentation, learning, patience, and an understanding of leverage that grows quietly over time. When consequences arrive, they do so without spectacle. People feel the absence before they understand the cause. By the time questions are asked, the answer is already irreversible. I'm sharing this with honesty, not to glorify suffering or paint myself as a hero, but to offer a truthful account of what it means to reclaim agency without burning everything down. There's no bitterness in where I landed, only alignment. If you've ever felt useful but unseen, valued for what you provide but not for who you are, maybe parts of this will sound familiar. And as you listen, I invite you to sit with one gentle question. Have there been moments in your life where silence wasn't chosen, but expected? I didn't arrive in people's lives loudly. I arrived useful. At work, I was introduced as Emma. She'll sort it out. Not the strategist, not the decision maker, just the one who made problems disappear. I was dependable in the way furniture is dependable. Always there, always functioning, rarely acknowledged unless something went wrong. Meetings happened around me, not with me. I'd be in the room, laptop open, taking notes no one asked for but everyone relied on later. When plans succeeded, They belonged to the loudest voice. When details failed, they traced quietly back to me, never publicly, never dramatically, just subtle shifts in expectation. A look, a pause. Outside of work, it wasn't much different. Friends leaned on me during transitions, breakups, crises. I was the calm presence, the listener, the one who remembered dates, preferences, unspoken boundaries. I wasn't the center of anyone's story. I was supporting structure, necessary but interchangeable in their minds. What made it more confusing was that none of this came with cruelty. No one yelled. No one insulted me outright. There were compliments, even. You're so easy to work with. You're so understanding. You don't make things complicated. Those words sound kind. They are not neutral. Over time, I noticed how decisions were framed after they were made. I noticed how my workload expanded without discussion, how expectations grew without permission. I noticed how my ideas, when voiced softly, were ignored, then repeated later by someone else, louder, and received as insight. Still, I told myself stories to stay comfortable. I told myself I preferred peace, that visibility was overrated, that not everyone needed to lead. I told myself that being indispensable was safer than being seen, that gratitude was a reasonable price for stability. What I didn't admit, at least not yet, was how carefully my role had been shaped. I wasn't just quiet by nature. I was quiet by design, rewarded when I stayed in my lane, gently corrected when I stepped outside it. They trusted me with execution, not judgment, with responsibility, not authority, with silence. And I complied, because compliance didn't feel like surrender at first. It felt like maturity, like professionalism, like being above ego. But invisibility has a cost. It drains slowly. You don't notice it day to day. You notice it years later, when you realize people describe you accurately, but incompletely. When you realize no one knows what you think, only what you do for them. That was who I was to them. Not weak, not naive, just assumed. And assumptions once made are rarely questioned until they fail. The first moment that stayed with me was small enough to dismiss. That's why I remember it. It happened in a weekly planning meeting, the kind that blended into the calendar without resistance. Same room, same seats, same voices leading, same ones responding. I had spent the previous 2 days untangling a scheduling conflict that threatened to delay a client deliverable. Nothing dramatic, just a series of overlapping dependencies no one else had noticed until they became inconvenient. I came in prepared, not with opinions, but with facts. A simple adjustment, a quiet solution. When the discussion reached the problem, I spoke, not forcefully, just clearly. If we shift the vendor timeline by 48 hours, I said, we can avoid the overlap without pushing the final delivery. There was no reaction, no disagreement, no acknowledgement. The conversation moved on as if I hadn't spoken. 5 minutes later, one of the senior managers leaned back in his chair and said, what if we just push the vendor timeline by 2 days? That might solve it. Heads nodded. Someone said, that's smart. Another wrote it on the board. I felt something then, not anger, not even embarrassment. Recognition. I had seen this before. Not once or twice, but often enough that my body knew the pattern before my mind named it. My contribution hadn't been rejected, it had been absorbed and reassigned, sanitized of its source. No one looked at me. No one checked my expression. There was no apology waiting to happen because, in their minds, nothing had occurred. I smiled. I always smiled. After the meeting, a colleague thanked me for helping smooth things out. That phrasing again, as if the idea had simply emerged from the room and I had been part of the atmosphere that made it possible. That was the cut. Not because the idea was taken, but because the taking was so effortless, so unexamined, as if my role was to contribute without imprint, to feed the system without being visible within it. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't replay the moment aloud. I didn't even journal about it that night. I folded it away under rational explanations. They didn't hear me. Timing was off. It wasn't personal. I should have spoken up more clearly. All reasonable thoughts, all incomplete, because the truth wasn't that I was unheard. It was that my voice didn't register as ownership. My presence didn't signal authorship. I was trusted with substance, but not with attribution. What made it more unsettling was how normal it felt to everyone else. No discomfort, no hesitation. The system functioned exactly as designed. And I went along with it. I stayed late that evening to finalize the revised timeline. I sent the follow-up email. I attached the documents. I made sure the execution matched the idea perfectly. Silence was expected, gratitude demanded. I felt the weight of that expectation then, faint but undeniable, like realizing a door had been quietly locked long ago, and I had been standing inside the room thinking it was open. That night, I didn't feel wronged. I felt placed. And once you notice the placement, you start noticing how often it happens. After that meeting, nothing changed on the surface. That's how normalization works. It doesn't arrive as a shock. It settles in as routine. The same patterns repeated quietly, efficiently. I'd flag a risk in advance, gently, almost apologetically. It would be dismissed as unlikely. Weeks later, when the risk materialized, the response was never, "Emma warned us." It was, "These things happen," followed by an unspoken expectation that I would help clean it up. And I did. I was the one who stayed calm when deadlines slipped, the one who reworked processes when assumptions failed, the one who filled the gaps between intention and reality. I became fluent in anticipation, learning to see what others missed, not because I was smarter, but because I paid attention. What I told myself was this: someone has to be the steady one. I watched how praise moved through the room. It traveled upward and outward, never sideways. People were rewarded for visibility, not precision, for confidence, not accuracy. I noticed how often being loud was mistaken for being decisive. Still, I stayed quiet, because every time I considered pushing back, a familiar logic surfaced. This isn't a battle worth fighting. You don't need recognition to know your value. Stirring things up will only make work harder. There's a kind of moral superiority in that thinking. It lets you feel above the mess while remaining inside it. It feels mature. It feels controlled. It also teaches people exactly how far they can go. Requests became assumptions. Assumptions became expectations. Expectations became obligations. My calendar filled without consultation. My responsibilities expanded without discussion. When I completed tasks efficiently, the reward was more of them. And when I hesitated, just once, there was confusion, not concern, confusion. You're usually so flexible, someone said, half joking, half surprised. Flexible, that word again. As if my boundaries were design flaws, not choices. What surprised me most was how often people framed their reliance on me as a compliment. We trust you. We know you'll handle it. You don't need much direction. Trust in this context meant autonomy without authority, responsibility without voice. It meant being accountable for outcomes I didn't shape. I rationalized it by telling myself I was learning, that proximity to decision-making was a form of education, that someday this would translate into opportunity. But the longer I stayed, the clearer it became. Proximity is not progression if the door never opens. I watched others fail loudly and recover publicly. Their mistakes were discussed, contextualized, forgiven. Mine were invisible because I prevented them. There was no narrative space for someone whose strength was avoidance of disaster. Over time, I began to edit myself preemptively. I stopped offering ideas unless asked directly. I softened my language even further. I learned which rooms rewarded silence and which punished it. And with each small adjustment, the role solidified, reliable, useful, invisible. I wasn't being abused. That made it harder to name. There was no villain to point to, no single moment to cite, just a gradual erosion of presence, disguised as harmony. By the time I noticed the cost, I had already helped teach them who I was allowed to be. The realization didn't come all at once. It arrived the way clarity often does, through repetition. I began to notice how differently people spoke to me depending on context. In private, they asked for my opinion. They trusted my judgment. They deferred to my experience when no one else was listening. But in public, that trust disappeared. My role shifted from advisor to executor. It wasn't that they didn't respect my competence. It was that they had quietly decided where it belonged. I was the one brought in after decisions were made to sense check them, the one asked to keep an eye on things, the one who made sure plans survived contact with reality. My value was in refinement, not direction. And I saw now how carefully that role was protected. When I tried to step outside it, offering a strategic perspective, questioning a premise, the response was subtle but immediate. A pause, a redirection, someone else taking over the narrative, no confrontation, just a gentle correction back into place. I realized then that roles aren't always assigned with words. They're enforced with reactions. Approval when you conform, distance when you don't. The most unsettling part was how reasonable it all seemed. There were no rules being broken, no policies violated, just a shared understanding of who did what and who didn't. I was reliable, which meant I wasn't risky. I was calm, which meant I wasn't disruptive. I was thorough, which meant I wasn't visionary. Those labels stuck, not because they were false, but because they were incomplete. Once I saw the role clearly, I couldn't unsee it. I noticed how introductions framed me, how my name was used to reassure others, not to elevate ideas. Emma will handle the details. Emma's across it. Never. Let's ask Emma what she thinks. The role came with an unspoken contract. I would provide stability, and in return, I would not challenge the hierarchy. I would be grateful for inclusion without influence. I would accept proximity as participation. And for a long time, I had signed that contract without reading it. What changed wasn't anger, it was discomfort, a quiet misalignment between who I was and who I was being allowed to be. I didn't want to be louder. I didn't want to dominate rooms. I just wanted my judgment to count where it mattered. I began to understand that staying quiet wasn't neutral anymore. It was reinforcing a structure that benefited from my silence. Every time I absorbed extra responsibility without question, I confirmed the role. Every time I solved problems invisibly, I strengthened the assumption that I would always do so. This wasn't about being overlooked, it was about being assigned a function and expected to remain within it. And that's when something subtle shifted inside me. Not outwardly, not yet. But once you see the role, you can decide whether to keep playing it. The day something shifted wasn't dramatic. There was no argument, no final straw, no moment where someone crossed a line so obvious it demanded a response. It was an ordinary afternoon, quiet enough that the change could be heard. I was reviewing a document that summarized months of work, process improvements, cost savings, risk mitigation. My fingerprints were on every page, though my name appeared nowhere. That wasn't unusual. What caught my attention was a single line in the executive summary, written by someone else. Thanks to team support, these outcomes were achieved smoothly. Team support, as if the work had simply happened. I stared at that sentence longer than necessary, not because I felt erased, but because I felt complicit. I had allowed this language to stand again and again because correcting it felt awkward, petty, even. I told myself outcomes mattered more than credit. But in that moment, I understood something I hadn't before. Language doesn't just describe reality, it shapes it. By allowing my contributions to be described as atmosphere rather than action, I was participating in my own disappearance. I closed the document and didn't reopen it. Instead, I noticed how tired I felt, not physically, but ethically. Tired of explaining away misalignment, tired of mistaking endurance for integrity, tired of being proud of how much I could carry without being seen. The shift wasn't a decision yet. It was a reorientation. I stopped asking, how do I make this work? I started asking, what does this cost me? That question followed me quietly over the next few weeks. I asked it in meetings, in emails, in moments where I instinctively moved to fill gaps. Each time, the answer was the same, a little more of myself. So I did something small. I paused. When a request came in late on a Friday, I didn't respond immediately. When a meeting invitation lacked context, I asked for clarification. When someone assumed I would just handle it, I asked how it aligned with my role. Nothing confrontational, nothing emotional, just accurate. The responses were telling. Some people adjusted easily, others bristled subtly, not because I was unreasonable, but because I was unfamiliar. I was no longer frictionless. That's when I understood the power of expectation. People don't react to what you do, they react to what you stop doing. The shift wasn't about asserting myself loudly, it was about withdrawing automatic compliance, about choosing silence intentionally, not reflexively. For the first time, I felt something like alignment, not satisfaction, not triumph, clarity. And clarity, once gained, doesn't fade. Once I stopped filling every gap, the silence changed texture. Before, it had been reactive, something I fell into because speaking felt inefficient. Now, it was deliberate, measured, chosen. I still listened. I still observed. But I no longer rushed to translate chaos into order for others. I let meetings end with unresolved questions. I let assumptions sit unanswered. I let people experience the weight of their own decisions without cushioning the impact. What surprised me was how quickly that silence was misinterpreted. People assumed I was disengaged, or overwhelmed, or quietly unhappy. No one considered that I might be intentional. That assumption worked in my favor, because while they mistook restraint for weakness, I was paying closer attention than ever. I noticed who panicked when things stalled, who deferred when certainty disappeared, who relied on me most when there was no safety net. I began documenting everything, not to build a case against anyone, but to understand the system as it actually functioned. I tracked dependencies, decision makers, external relationships. I noted where information bottlenecked and who benefited from it. And still, I said very little. Silence, when chosen, creates space. In that space, patterns reveal themselves. People showed me what they valued by what they chased when nothing was handed to them. Some chased control, some chased approval, some chased speed at the expense of stability. I chased alignment. There were moments when staying quiet felt risky, when stepping in would have earned quick praise. But I resisted the urge because I was no longer interested in being rewarded for erasing myself. Instead, I began to reposition subtly. I asked questions in private. I clarified expectations in writing. I ensured that my responsibilities were explicit, not assumed. Where before I had absorbed ambiguity, now I reflected it back. The system didn't collapse. It adjusted. And in those adjustments, I saw something important. My silence had never been the glue. It had been the crutch. By removing it, I wasn't sabotaging anything. I was revealing the true load-bearing structures and where they were weak. No one accused me of anything. There was no conflict to point to, just a quiet recalibration of dynamics. I felt less visible and more powerful. Because power, I learned, isn't volume. It's optionality. It's the ability to act, or not, without fear. Silence had become my choice, and with that choice came leverage. While they adjusted to my new quiet, something else was happening, something almost no one noticed, because it didn't look like ambition. It looked like consistency. I was still doing my job well. That was important. I didn't withdraw competence, only excess. I delivered exactly what was agreed, nothing more, nothing less. That made my work invisible in a new way, clean, contained, difficult to criticize. What changed was where my attention went. I began to study the organization the way an outsider would, not emotionally, structurally. I mapped how decisions actually moved versus how they were described in presentations. I noted which approvals were ceremonial and which were essential. I learned which external partners trusted the brand and which trusted specific people. One of those people was me. I had spent years being the stable point of contact for vendors, auditors, and clients during moments of uncertainty. I was calm when others escalated, clear when others hedged. Over time, trust had consolidated quietly without announcement. I never weaponized that trust. I simply acknowledged it. I also became meticulous with documentation, not as a defensive move, but as a form of self-respect. I wrote follow-up emails that clarified decisions. I summarized conversations neutrally. I kept records not of conflict, but of responsibility. No drama, just facts. In parallel, I invested in myself without advertising it. I refined skills that didn't shine in meetings, but mattered in transitions, process design, compliance nuance, contract language. I learned how risk is assessed when no one is posturing. All of it was preparation, though it didn't feel like plotting. It felt like finally telling the truth about how things worked. What they never noticed was that my silence had freed bandwidth. I wasn't expending energy managing perceptions anymore. I wasn't cushioning egos. That energy went somewhere else, into competence that didn't ask permission. I also paid attention to timing, to cycles, to when people were most confident and therefore least attentive. I understood that systems reveal their vulnerabilities not under pressure, but under comfort. And I waited, not passively, patiently, because quiet dominance isn't about striking. It's about positioning yourself so that when you move, movement is inevitable. They thought nothing was happening. They were wrong. The private reveal didn't arrive as a shock. There was no moment where I leaned back in my chair and thought, this changes everything. It was slower than that, quieter, almost gentle. It began with noticing how often my name appeared in places where authority supposedly didn't live. I was reviewing routine correspondence. Nothing urgent, nothing dramatic. Contracts that had been renewed automatically. Emails that had passed through me simply because they always had. Summaries forwarded for context, even when I was no longer officially responsible. Individually, none of it meant much. Together, it told a story. I started laying things side by side, not intentionally at first, just out of habit. A timeline here, a stakeholder note there, a decision log that referenced a rationale no one else seemed to remember. Over time, a pattern emerged that I hadn't allowed myself to name before. Decisions were being made without me, but held together by me. Risk was being taken by people with authority and absorbed by people with memory. And I was the memory. I was the one external partners trusted to interpret tone, not just terms. The one who understood which clauses mattered in practice and which were ceremonial. The one who knew which deadlines were flexible and which were reputational. Not because I'd been appointed, because I had stayed. That's when it became clear. My value wasn't positional, it was relational. And relational power doesn't announce itself. It accumulates quietly, through consistency, through restraint, through being the person who doesn't panic when others do. I saw then what would happen if I disappeared, not chaos, not collapse, drift. Decisions would still be made, but with more hesitation. Partners would still respond, but with more questions. Processes would still exist, but without the context that made them efficient. The system wouldn't break, it would slow, and in slowing, it would reveal its dependency. That was the reveal, not leverage in the dramatic sense. No button to press, no threat to issue. Just an understanding of where my absence would be felt and where my presence had been quietly underwriting confidence. What surprised me was how little satisfaction came with that clarity. There was no urge to test it, no desire to demonstrate importance. In fact, the opposite. I felt an unexpected sense of responsibility to not use this knowledge carelessly, because leverage doesn't ask to be proven, it asks to be respected. I also realized something more uncomfortable. Knowing this meant I could no longer pretend staying was neutral. If I remained, I would be choosing to continue carrying weight without authority, with full awareness. That would make it a decision, not a circumstance. And once you see that, innocence is gone. The private reveal wasn't about power over others. It was about honesty with myself, about acknowledging that what I had been offering wasn't being met with equivalence, not because people were malicious, but because the system had adapted around my silence. Seeing that didn't make me angry. It made the next step unavoidable, because once you know where you stand, truly stand, continuing without change is no longer patience. It's consent. Reaching the decision point didn't feel like standing at a crossroads. It felt more like noticing that the road I was on had been narrowing for a long time, and that continuing forward would require me to keep turning sideways just to fit. For weeks after the private reveal, I did nothing visible. I kept working. I kept listening. Outwardly, I remained exactly who I had been. Inwardly, I was running quiet experiments, not with people, but with truth. I asked myself hard questions without trying to soften the answers. If nothing changes, what does my life look like in a year? If I speak up now, what actually improves? And for whom? If I stay, what am I teaching others about how I can be treated? These weren't emotional questions. They were structural. And the more honestly I answered them, the clearer the pattern became. Staying would require me to keep translating my value into forms the system already understood. It would mean advocating not just for my ideas, but for my right to have them considered. That kind of effort isn't growth. It's negotiation with a structure that benefits from your accommodation. Leaving loudly, naming patterns, forcing recognition, insisting on acknowledgement was tempting in theory. But when I imagined it, something in me recoiled. Not because I was afraid, but because it would tie my clarity to their response. I didn't want to be validated. I wanted to be aligned. The real decision wasn't between staying or leaving. It was between continuing to explain myself and choosing myself without explanation. That distinction changed everything. I realized that asking for a different role would still be asking. Even if I received it, it would arrive as a concession, not as recognition. And concessions can always be reversed. I also realized that my silence, if I stayed, would eventually become dishonest. Not to them, to me, because I would be choosing comfort over coherence and calling it maturity. So the decision formed the way all true decisions do, quietly, completely, and without witnesses. There was no moment where I thought, This will show them. There was only the realization this no longer belongs to me. Once that truth landed, there was no anxiety about outcome, no mental rehearsal of conversations, no contingency planning around persuasion. I didn't need agreement to leave. I didn't need permission. I didn't need acknowledgement. I needed closure with myself. And that came when I understood this. Staying would require me to keep making myself legible to a system that had never tried to read me fully. Leaving would allow me to stop performing clarity for people who were comfortable with my silence. That made the choice irreversible, not dramatic, not defiant, just final. Once the decision was made, urgency disappeared. That's something people don't talk about enough. When you're undecided, everything feels heavy and rushed. When you've decided, time slows down. You stop reacting. You start sequencing. I didn't announce anything, not to colleagues, not to friends, not even to myself in words. I let the decision live quietly while I translated it into action. The first thing I did was audit my own dependencies, not theirs, mine. I reviewed my finances with a level of honesty I hadn't needed before. I simplified where I could. I reduced optional expenses. I built a buffer, not out of fear, but out of respect for my future self. Freedom isn't dramatic, it's prepared. At work, I did something counterintuitive. I became even more precise. Every responsibility was clarified in writing. Every deliverable was scoped. I stopped accepting vague requests phrased as favors. If something mattered, it went on the record. If it didn't, it waited. No one challenged this directly. They adapted. That told me everything I needed to know. I also began to untangle myself from informal obligations, the kind no one assigns, but everyone expects. I redirected questions to appropriate owners. I stepped back from being the default translator between departments. When someone said, "Can you just," I responded with, "Who should own that long term?" At first, there was mild confusion, then acceptance. People don't fight for what they've taken for granted. They simply adjust to its absence. Externally, I prepared just as carefully. I gave advance notice to partners, not about leaving, but about transitions. I introduced secondary contacts. I documented contexts that had lived only in my head for years. I did this not to protect the organization, but to protect my integrity. I wasn't disappearing. I was concluding. There's a difference. What no one noticed was that I stopped future-proofing. I stopped building systems meant to outlast my presence. I stopped anticipating needs that hadn't been articulated. The work became finite, contained. I also stopped correcting narratives. When people framed outcomes vaguely, the team, the process, support, I let it stand. Not because I agreed, but because I was no longer invested in shaping how my contribution was perceived there. That energy was being redirected elsewhere. Quietly, I explored options, not impulsively, methodically. I spoke to people who had known me in different contexts, former colleagues, mentors, contacts who had seen me outside the role I was exiting. Conversations were framed around fit, not escape. I didn't say I was unhappy. I said I was aligning. That distinction matters. At no point did I use leverage. I didn't hint at disruption. I didn't position myself as indispensable. I didn't negotiate from threat or scarcity. I let the system assume stability right up until the moment it no longer applied. There's a particular kind of discipline required for this phase, the discipline to remain kind while detaching, to remain competent while disengaging emotionally, to not seek affirmation from people whose understanding has already been defined. Some days were harder than others. There were moments when I watched decisions being made poorly and felt the reflex to intervene, when I saw avoidable issues forming and had to remind myself, this is no longer mine to solve. That restraint wasn't passive, it was practiced. I was learning how to let others own the consequences of structures they benefited from. Still, I left no mess behind, no loose ends, no ambiguity about what I had done or delivered. Silence, yes, but not neglect. The most telling part of this period was how calm I felt. Not excited, not relieved, centered, because I was no longer waiting for permission to move. I had already granted it. By the time I formally submitted my resignation, brief, professional, unembellished, the shift had already occurred. Internally, I had been gone for weeks. The silence had done its work. And the consequences, though not yet visible, were already in motion. The consequences didn't arrive as fallout. They arrived as confusion. At first, nothing obvious happened. My resignation was acknowledged politely, almost casually. There were well wishes, a few surprised expressions. Someone said, "You'll be missed," in the way people say it when they assume systems absorb loss automatically. I stayed through my notice period, exactly as agreed. I transferred files. I walked people through processes. I answered questions once, never twice. When something wasn't documented, I documented it. When something required judgment, I explained the framework, not the conclusion. Still, the absence hadn't landed yet. That came later. It started with delays that no one could quite explain. A response that took longer than usual. A partner who asked the same question twice because context had gone missing. A meeting that ran in circles because no one could articulate why a decision had been made months earlier. Nothing broke. Things just slowed. I heard about it indirectly at first. A former colleague mentioned how strange it felt without me there. Not harder, just less clear, less anchored. People assumed it was temporary, that someone would step into the space naturally, that roles would stretch and reform the way they always had. But what they hadn't realized was that my role hadn't been a role. It had been an accumulation. It took time for that to register. I wasn't copied on emails anymore, but echoes reached me. A vendor escalated unnecessarily. A process had to be rebuilt from scratch because no one knew why it had been designed that way. Decisions stalled because the person responsible didn't have the relationships to move them forward quietly. I didn't feel satisfaction hearing this. I felt distance, because consequences are only satisfying when you're still emotionally invested. I wasn't. What struck me was how often people framed the issues as abstract. Growing pains, transition challenges, one of those things. No one said my name. That was telling. It meant the system still couldn't see me clearly, even in absence. It could feel the loss without identifying the source. like a building with a removed beam that hadn't yet cracked, but no longer felt solid. There were moments when I could have stepped back in, offered advice, smoothed edges, reassured people. It would have been welcomed. I knew that. I chose not to, not out of spite, out of consistency. I had exited cleanly. Re-entry would only recreate the same dynamic under a different label. Help without authority, presence without respect. So I stayed silent. Meanwhile, my own life began to recalibrate. New conversations deepened. New responsibilities came with clarity and boundaries I didn't have to fight for. My voice landed differently because it wasn't pre-filtered by old assumptions. The contrast was sharp. Back there, people were trying to fix symptoms. Here, I was being asked to shape direction. Back there, confusion spread quietly. Here, alignment reduced noise. The consequences continued to unfold, not as punishment, but as exposure. The system had relied on something it never acknowledged. Now it had to either adapt honestly or continue compensating inefficiently. Either way, it would not be my work anymore. That was the true consequence, not what they lost, but what I no longer carried. By the time the panic surfaced, it was already misdirected. It didn't show up as an apology or a realization. It showed up as urgency. Emails marked high priority, meetings scheduled hastily, questions asked too late in the process to matter. I started receiving messages that felt unfamiliar in tone, polite but strained, casual but purposeful. Quick question: do you remember why we structured it this way? Just checking if you might have insight on a partner expectation. Would you mind hopping on a short call to clarify something? None of these asked how I was. None acknowledged the timing. They weren't reaching out to me as a person. They were reaching for a function that no longer existed. At first, I responded minimally. I answered what I could, briefly, within the boundaries I had already set. I didn't reopen context. I didn't re-enter systems. I didn't correct assumptions that should have been addressed months earlier. Then the messages slowed. Not because things were resolved, but because people realized something uncomfortable. I couldn't fix this without stepping back into the role I had left. That's when the tone changed. There was confusion now, frustration, a subtle sense of betrayal, though no one named it as such. Expectations linger long after agreements end. I heard later that meetings were tense, that responsibility bounced between people without landing, that solutions were proposed, reversed, reproposed, not because anyone lacked intelligence, but because coherence had been outsourced for too long. What made it irreversible wasn't my absence. It was the timing. You can renegotiate a role before someone leaves. You can't retroactively respect boundaries you never acknowledged. By the time people understood what I had been holding together, they were already trying to rebuild it under pressure. And rebuilding under pressure reveals everything you avoided when things were easy. No one reached out to ask me to come back. That would have required naming the gap honestly. Instead, they tried to recreate my function without recreating the conditions that allowed it to exist. It didn't work, and it couldn't have, because the issue was never capacity, it was clarity. Too late to fix it, not because I refused, but because the system had already moved past the point where quiet corrections could save it. And so had I. The confrontation, when it finally came, didn't look like one. There was no raised voice, no emotional appeal, no attempt to defend or accuse. If anything, it felt more like an audit than a reckoning, quiet, careful, and slightly overdue. The message arrived on an ordinary morning. A senior leader I had worked closely with, though never transparently, asked if I would be open to a conversation. They framed it as reflection, closure, learning. I said yes without hesitation, not because I owed them anything, but because I no longer carried anything that could be reopened. We met in a neutral space, not the office, not somewhere symbolic, just a quiet cafe with enough distance to keep the conversation grounded. They arrived early. That alone told me something had shifted. We talked first about neutral things, time passing, how quickly roles change, how complex things had become. They spoke more than I did at the beginning, and I let them. People often reveal the truth when they're trying to sound reasonable. Eventually, they said it. We didn't fully understand how much you were holding together. It wasn't an apology, and I didn't need it to be. There was no defensiveness in their voice, only surprise, tinged with discomfort, as if they had discovered a structural flaw in a building they'd walked through every day without looking up. I listened. I didn't rush to reassure them. I didn't minimize what they were saying. Silence, used properly, invites clarity. They spoke about the aftermath, about how things now required more meetings, more alignment, more explanation, about how decisions felt heavier, less intuitive, about how confidence had been replaced with caution. They didn't say my name often. That mattered because even now they were describing an absence without fully acknowledging its source, not out of malice, out of habit. When they finally asked me why I had left, it wasn't framed as a challenge. It was framed as curiosity, as if the answer might be logistical. I kept my response simple. I realized I was being relied on without being included. I said, that works for systems. It doesn't work for people. They paused. I could see them recalibrating, not emotionally, but conceptually, trying to fit my words into a framework they understood. They asked what they could have done differently. That question is often a trap. It invites negotiation of the past. I didn't take it. It would have required changing how value is recognized, I said. Not in theory, in practice. I didn't list examples. I didn't recount moments. I didn't name names. If someone needs a catalog of evidence to understand a pattern, they're not ready to see it. They nodded, slowly, not in agreement, but in recognition of complexity. We sat in that for a moment. There was no attempt to bring me back, no offer, no proposal. That, too, was telling. Because by the time understanding arrives, opportunity often has already passed. When we stood to leave, they thanked me for my work, my honesty, my time. I thanked them in return, not because everything had been resolved, but because nothing was left unresolved inside me. The confrontation had no heat because it didn't need any. Heat is for moments where something still needs to be fought for. I was already free. Who I am now is quieter than who I was becoming back then, but not smaller. If anything, my life has fewer sharp edges because I no longer spend energy dulling myself to fit into spaces that benefited from my restraint. I don't feel the need to prove steadiness anymore. I choose it, and that distinction has changed everything. I still work hard. That never left me. But my work now exists inside clear agreements, not unspoken expectations. I'm no longer rewarded for absorbing ambiguity. I'm valued for naming it. When I'm asked for input, it's because my judgment is wanted, not because my availability is assumed. That difference is subtle, but it's the difference between presence and participation. I've noticed how my voice lands differently now. Not louder, not more forceful, just received. When I speak, there's space around my words. People pause, they consider. Sometimes they disagree, but even that feels respectful because it's happening on the same level. I don't confuse calm with compliance anymore. The old version of me believed that strength meant endurance, that dignity meant not needing acknowledgement, that maturity meant staying quiet when something felt misaligned. I don't judge that version of myself harshly. She did the best she could with what she understood at the time. But I no longer mistake self-erasure for grace. Now, when something doesn't sit right, I don't rush to explain it away. I don't tell myself stories to stay comfortable. I ask one question: does this align with how I want to live and work? If the answer is no, I don't negotiate it into yes. That clarity has simplified my relationships too. I no longer attract people who need me to disappear in order to function. I attract people who are comfortable with shared responsibility, with visible contribution, with mutual respect. There's less intensity, less drama, less noise, and in that quiet, there's something I didn't expect: lightness. Not happiness in the cinematic sense, just a steady sense of rightness, of being where I am without bracing myself, of knowing that if I leave a room, professionally or personally, it will be because the chapter ended, not because I was quietly written out. I don't replay old moments anymore. I don't wonder what would have happened if I'd spoken sooner or pushed harder. The answer is irrelevant. What matters is this: I didn't become louder to be seen. I became clearer. And clarity has a way of reorganizing everything around it. I am no longer the one who holds things together without being named. I am no longer grateful for space that costs me my voice. I am no longer silent by default. Who I am now is someone who understands that quiet dominance isn't about control. It's about alignment. And once you have that, you don't need to reprove anything to anyone. There's a temptation at the end of stories like this to frame everything as a lesson neatly learned, to say, "And then I understood my worth," and let that sentence carry all the weight. But real closure is rarely that clean. What I understand now is something quieter and more useful. Most roles we outgrow are not forced on us. They are accepted, slowly, reasonably, with good intentions. We step into them because they feel safe, because they reward reliability, because they promise stability if we don't ask for too much. And then one day, we realize the role has been shaping us more than we've been shaping it. Silence in those roles is rarely neutral. It is often interpreted as agreement, as availability, as permanence. And gratitude, when demanded instead of offered, becomes a way to keep people from asking whether the arrangement is still fair. For a long time, I believed that leaving quietly meant losing, that if I didn't explain myself, I would be misunderstood, forgotten, rewritten. What I learned instead is this: You don't need to be understood to be free. You need to be aligned. The most profound shift wasn't external. It wasn't the slowed systems, the awkward realizations, or the belated acknowledgments. It was internal. The moment I stopped measuring my choices by how palatable they were to people who had already benefited from my restraint. I didn't win by being indispensable. I won by being optional. And that's an uncomfortable truth because it doesn't reward martyrdom. It doesn't validate overgiving. It asks something harder, the willingness to let things wobble without rushing to steady them, just to prove you still matter. Quiet dominance isn't about making others feel small. It's about refusing to make yourself smaller, to maintain harmony that only flows one way. If there's a moral here, it isn't speak up more. It isn't leave sooner. Those are surface level takeaways. The deeper one is this: pay attention to what your silence is doing, not what it avoids, but what it enables. If your quiet keeps systems running that exclude you, your silence isn't peacekeeping, it's participation. And participation, unlike silence, is a choice you can revisit. I don't regret the years I spent being dependable. They taught me precision, patience, and discernment. But I don't romanticize them either. Endurance is not a virtue when it requires self-erasure. What I hope this story offers isn't inspiration in the dramatic sense, but recognition, the kind that makes you pause during a familiar moment, a meeting, a relationship, a recurring request, and ask yourself whether the role you're playing is still one you consent to. Because resignation doesn't always come with a letter. Sometimes it begins with a decision no one else hears. If this story resonated with you, I'd genuinely like to know, have you ever realized, quietly, without a scene, that a role you were grateful for once was no longer the one you wanted to live in? And if there is one final thought I want to leave you with, it is this: silence is not always a virtue. Sometimes it is simply a habit that has been rewarded for too long. Life doesn't always ask us to stand up, speak loudly, or prove ourselves to anyone, but it does ask something more difficult: honesty with ourselves about the cost of staying. When you choose to leave without an audience, without explanations, without a visible victory, it isn't avoidance. It's clarity. It's the moment you stop measuring your worth by how well you endure what no longer fits. And that kind of departure, quiet, deliberate, and complete, often creates a freedom that lasts longer than any applause ever could.